Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Croccast podcast. I'm your host, Nate, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Miss Phoebe Griffith. Phoebe, welcome to
Hi,
the show.
thank you very much. Delighted to join you today.
And quick background on Phoebe, she is a PhD researcher with the University of Oxford and the London Zoological Society, and currently doing conservation ecology research with the gharials in Nepal. So, and she's also a National Geographic explorer. So that's the first for the show.
Oh, how exciting. Makes me sound much more important than I am.
So, Phoebe, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
So, Phoebe, mind telling us a little bit about yourself, how you first got started into reptiles?
Yeah, for sure. So, I've always been, yeah, completely fascinated by sort of reptiles and amphibians. And I actually grew up in Nepal, and so was completely obsessed with crocodiles and gharials. So we used to go down to the south of the country, and I just used to sit for like 8 hours straight watching crocodiles doing nothing, which I thought was very exciting. And so I've, yeah, always just thought that reptiles in general were hugely fascinating, but a particular love of crocodiles and also sharks. But I discovered at a young age I got seasick, so that was the end of my thought of working on them. And then I did a kind of straightforward, went to uni and studied biology, followed by wild animal biology. When I was very lucky to meet a conservationist who'd been advising on programs of gharial conservation in Nepal and India. And that was kind of my first connection. And yeah, that was it. After that, I've never looked back since.
All right. So, with your current work at the University of Oxford and the London Zoological Society, as I mentioned before, you're doing research with the gharial populations in India. So, mind giving us a brief overview of what that all entails?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm primarily based in Chitwan National Park in Nepal, where the government of Nepal in the 70s set up a gharial conservation program in response to having seen the wild populations just completely collapse. And so this was started up by the late Dr. Tirthaman Meske, who's a bit of a hero of mine. Um, and so they set up this program and they started collecting all the nests from the wild and releasing gharial back into the wild after spending sort of 4 to 5 years in a breeding centre when they were at a much larger size and they weren't going to get eaten by predators. And this program is still ongoing, but the population had not really increased between the late 70s and about 2006. Um, and then had slowly seen some increases since then. But there were still a lot of questions remaining about um, why exactly, despite this sort of intensive conservation investment and program, the numbers hadn't really increased and the population definitely hasn't recovered to those kind of levels that were seen in the 50s or earlier. And so basically, I'm very lucky. I'm just one person in the project. I collaborate with a number of other organisations. So the rest of the team at the Zoological Society London ZSL, the Chitwan National Park, and the National Trust for Nature Conservation and Himalayan Nature, and basically kind of working together, we came up with this sort of set of questions asking what was happening. We thought, well, what's happening to these animals after they're released from captivity? In the kind of short term, are they surviving? And in the longer term, we're saying, well, if they were released from captivity, are they growing into adults that kind of nest and breed normally? Is that seen in these kind of adults that were originally released from captivity? And try oh yeah, and then kind of thinking, well, there's this protected area. Our gharial in India have been shown to be migratory species, moving over 200 kilometers in a year. Is the same behavior seen in Nepal? And if so, is that taking them outside of protected areas or potentially over? There's a big dam or barrage on the sort of Indo-Nepal border, potentially on a one-way trip across that, and they're not able to come back up. So yeah, working together with the Chitwan National Park team, they were the kind of key questions we came up with back in 2017, and then we've been trying to answer them ever since.
Okay, so what are some of the threats that are and pressures that are kind of keeping gharial numbers down?
Well, so it seems like initially, sort of populations seem to have collapsed after dams or barrages were built on rivers. And this seems to have a number of impacts on populations. The first being the sort of when the water's kept back and then released later in the season. If the gharial are downstream of the dam, that can lead to the flooding of nests. And similarly, when barrage gates are closed, that can lead the water to like back up behind the dam. And then similarly again, that can then flood nests on the upstream side. So this was definitely identified as a big issue in Nepal back in the 70s. Was one of the reasons they started collecting in the nests. And also they can completely fragment populations. So they build a dam, you've got half your population on the north or the upstream side and half on the downstream side. And that can just lead to the populations being too small to be viable. And then the other major issue that we particularly have in Nepal is accidental bycatch. So gharial, particularly with their very snaggly teeth that sort of sit out the sides of their mouths, they can really easily get tangled in gill nets. So nets that are classically sort of set in the river to catch fish and made of artificial fibers and plastic. So they're really, really strong. And either they catch smaller gharial and drown them, or people who set the nets kind of catch a gharial in their net accidentally, don't really know what to do with it, but want to get their net back, or they're frightened, so they might kill it. Or in the larger animals, they often can break away, but then if they've got the net stuck around their snout, they can starve over time. So those are the kind of dams and barrages and fishing, accidental fishing pressure are kind of two major issues. And then some sort of emerging problems are especially sand mining. So sand mining for the construction industry is an absolutely massive extractive industry throughout Asia. And river sand is perfect for the construction for all the cities that we as humans love to live in. And this is really impacting on rivers throughout Asia, including those that gharial live in. And in some places, the whole bank where they would need to bask and lay their eggs are simply being mined away. And there's very little regulation to deal with this. A lot is done illegally. There are sort of issues of sand mining mafias and human rights issues. So yeah, that's kind of a big emerging issue at the moment. But yeah, so gharial are kind of sensitive to everything. They need these lovely banks to bask on and lay their nests on. They need huge stretches of river to move between. They need numbers of fish to eat. So kind of any disruption to the river system kind of has a knock-on impact on gharial. They're not very tough.
Sound like a classic keystone species.
Yeah, they are. Bless them. Not
Yeah.
doing terribly well.
So you mentioned that since 2006, they have seen a slight increase in gharial population. So there's, I guess, a hint of good news with that. Want to go a bit further in
Yeah,
that?
I think there's definitely more than a hint of good news. It's something I'm really excited about. So this is particularly so during that time, the Gharial Breeding Centre has been run by Beb Bahadur Kudka, who's my project advisor, who is a really committed conservationist, and his team who work on the sort of breeding centre there, and they've been monitoring the nesting and sort of orchestrating the releases for a long time. And basically, they've got the survival rates much higher than they were previously in the breeding centre, which means they can now end up releasing about 100 gharial a year. And so part of that increase is simply that they're releasing such a large number of gharial that even if only 30 or 40% are surviving and staying in Nepal, that's sort of seeing this steady increase. And what's also really exciting is that now some of those gharial that were released around kind of 2006 onwards are reaching adult size. And they seem to be nesting really well. So particularly those female gharial that were from the centre, the vast majority of them, particularly if they're released at a young age, they seem to be growing up to adult size and then showing all the normal breeding behaviours. And there are now, in fact, enough nests in Chitwan, still not very many, but just about enough that they don't collect them all into the centre anymore. They leave them in the wild. And we found that considerable number of sort of yearlings and juveniles that we're citing every year more and more. So we're still talking tiny numbers. We're still talking only like 200 hatchlings in the wild every year, But of those, even if only 10% are growing up to be adult gharial, that is inevitably leading to an increase in the population. And another sort of very important factor has been that the kind of area of suitable river habitat for gharial to use that's protected has been increasing through community conservation initiatives, particularly community-led conservation of forests and rivers. So these are small rivers that are outside of the national park itself, but communities have decided to protect them, to use them for tourism or sustainable extraction. And so actually this year we found that the gharial were nesting inside those community forests, which is great, and they're really nice. We've got gharial living with them all year round. So there's also just been this kind of increase in suitable habitat, which has had this, again, not positive knock-on effect on the population.
That's actually really great news here, especially since they are such a unique species of crocodilian.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah,
And
for
yeah, sorry.
yeah for people that at home don't know that much about them, you want to go into details about how they're kind of different and separated from the other crocodilians.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of looking at the kind of crocodilian family tree, you've got the alligators and caimans, who are a related group. You then have the crocodiles, which contains a huge number of species found all over the world. And then off on this other branch, you have the gharials, and there's actually only two species of gharial in this third group. There's the one I've been talking about, the gharial, which is also called the Indian gharial, Gavialis gangeticus. And then the other one is a Southeast Asian species, sometimes called the false gharial, but now generally called the tomistoma, which is also a really cool species. And they have the two longest, thinnest skulls of any living crocodilian today, and especially the gharial, the sort of one I work with, they have this incredibly long, thin skull that's really specialized for catching fish and other aquatic prey. So unlike kind of you classically think about alligators and crocodiles as these predators that catch a lot of their prey at the side of the water, drown small mammals, or in the case of like Nile crocodiles, large mammals. Gharial don't do that at all. They pretty much only eat fish, and then occasionally they'll grab a turtle or a crustacean or some river bugs and the very occasional duck. But they are really, really predominantly a fish-eating species, and they're also the most aquatic crocodiles. So unlike other crocs, they can't sort of get their legs under their bodies and stand up and walk like you'll see in those like videos of alligators in Florida walking across the golf course. Not a hope of that for a gharial. They literally can only shuffle like a turtle, so they're useless on land. They just kind of push themselves along, which means they really, really can't cross any distance at all on land. I think the furthest I've seen one from the river is like 3 or 4 meters. And that was really surprising. We were like, why is it so far away from the water? Yeah, they're, which is one of the reasons they're so threatened, because whereas like with other dams, the muggers, the type of crocodile that live in the same river of gharial, they just get up and walk around. Whereas a gharial just sits at the bottom looking sad. But yeah, so they're this, they're really, really sort of weird looking with this long thin skull, and they're evolutionarily unique because they're only got this one other vaguely closely related croc species, but actually they're not that closely related at all. And then just to make them a little bit even weirder, they have this sexual dimorphism, so the males and females look different. So not only do the males get absolutely huge, they can get over 6 meters and weigh over a ton. They grow when they start to mature at around 4 meters. They start to grow this weird lump on the end of their nose called a gara. The word gara comes from the Sanskrit word for a clay pot, because it kind of looks like a badly made clay pot on their nose. And as the male gets bigger and bigger, this gara gets bigger and bigger as well. And that's the name gharial, with the gara. And they use that, it seems to be used for acoustic communication. So it's used for making a noise called a pop, which is kind of a loud percussive noise that the males use for communicating. So yeah, they're a pretty weird looking and weird acting croc.
Yeah, and their eyes are kind of different looking from other crocodilians as well.
They kind of look bug like. I've
Yeah,
always thought.
telescoped.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so gharials have a unique reproductive and parenting behavior compared to other crocodilians, right?
Yeah, they do. So they have this communal nesting behavior, where all the females lay their eggs in kind of nests in a single sandbank, and then they have fairly coordinated hatching events. They tend to hatch within about a week of each other, and all the babies come down from the nests after the females dig them up and form huge creches. So all the babies in an area will form a single creche that's guarded. We found in Nepal that they're primarily guarded by females, but in the Chumbel River in India, the dads also play a massive role. So these huge adult males and the females as well will guard creches of, up to over 2,000 hatchlings. Um, which is incredible to see. And kind of makes you really optimistic because you're looking at this huge, huge crash of these little tiny crocodiles. And you're like, oh, they're not going to be critically endangered for much longer. But there's a long way to go from
Yeah,
being a tiny croc in a crash to being a 3 meter reproducing adult.
yeah, yeah. It's quite a bit of time and quite a few predators in between them there.
Sadly so.
Yeah. So, you recently got some data, your first batch of data from your research. You mind going into some detail about that, or?
Yeah, for sure. So we've the main sort of focus of our project in Nepal has been a radio telemetry study. So we tagged 20 wild caught gharial, and we also tagged 25 gharial released from captivity. And we've been monitoring these guys for 3 years now. Our last batteries have just kind of dropped out to try and understand how gharial that live in the environment are moving and using that environment, what the threats to them are, and if they're dying, why. And similarly, asking the same sort of questions, but focusing on those first 2 years after gharial are released, which has been shown in previous studies to seem to be a sort of high risk time for gharial just disappearing, and people weren't really sure what happened to them. And what was quite interesting, so sort of thinking first about the ones that have been released from captivity, is we found that a small number of them are, if they end up in this sort of main, they're released on a small tributary, and if they end up in this kind of main big glacier-fed river called the Narayani, they by their first monsoon. So during the monsoon, the river level just increases phenomenally, and what's previously quite a big river becomes absolutely giant river. And we find that the gharials released from captivity that ended up in that river during their first monsoon just disappeared off down to India. And only one of them ever came back. So it seems that this is a kind of a really important thing to consider with these release programs, particularly because we found that by the second monsoon, not the same effect at all. All those gharial that were in that river stayed in the river, even during the large floods. So it seems to be that when you initially are releasing these crocs from captivity, they perhaps don't have the same response to the environment and behaviours as you see in wild hatched gharial. Um, so that was really interesting. And we also had huge numbers of them are sadly being killed accidentally, we think, in getting caught in these gill nets. They're technically illegal, but they're still pretty widely used at night to avoid people getting caught using them. And we found surprisingly high number of these small gharial are getting caught in them and drowning, or slightly more of them are getting caught in them and people are killing those gharial in order to get the nets back. So those big problems. But on the plus side, we found that all the large resident gharial that we caught and tagged, very few of them died over the sort of study period. And we found some of them, even ones that were released from captivity, are still showing those same migratory behaviors that are seen in India. So some of these females are making, 150-kilometer journeys in the year to go from good feeding sites to good nesting sites, whereas others are just staying put. We had one female who's not gone more than a mile in 2.5 years. She just stuck around. It was a good area. There was no need to go anywhere else, so she didn't. But in particular, what's happening, this really important for conservation, is that during the monsoon, when the river levels rise, is the gharial are going out into the small tributaries of the river and way outside of the national park up into areas that are heavily agricultural and urban, where there's pretty much no natural habitat left. They're in these little tiny rivers going through the middle of paddy fields, and a lot of gharial are going there, but what surprised us was a lot of adult gharial are going there. It's kind of known that the smaller gharial do occasionally go sort of on these monsoon trips out of the river channel, but we were surprised that lots of the big adults were doing the same. Um, so that's kind of a really important thing to think about for the future is, well, how do we protect them when they are in these agricultural areas? Um, so yeah, all really interesting kind of for just thinking about how gharial behave, but also for now thinking about, well, how do we protect them year round?
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned that at least some of the females would travel up to like 120 kilometers a year. Um, so would that be just to follow like food sources and moving between food sources and nesting grounds, or is there any other potential reason why they do that?
Yeah, so it kind of it's interesting. So we haven't um, this sort of behavior, this migratory behavior, was first seen by the Gharial Ecology Project on the Chambal River in India, which is a completely awesome research project that's been running over 10 years now. And they're kind of one of our partner projects. And they found through tagging gharial, I think they tagged their first gharial in 2008, that all their adult males and females in the lower part of the Chambal are making really, really big journeys. And this seems to be because the really good feeding for adults is at the confluence of the Yamuna and Chambal rivers. So during the monsoon, when there's this high volume in the river and they've got this confluence, this seems to be the best place for fishing. So all the adults go here and spend the whole monsoon just eating all day. And then at the end of the monsoon, as the river level drops, and gharial don't really eat very much in the winter, they do their breeding in the spring. So they kind of all go back up the river, and those females and the males will go as far back as they need to go to find mates and suitable nesting sites. And they will, yeah, just keep traveling until they find their kind of preferred male or female to mate with, and the sort of ideal big high sandbanks. And we found slightly different sort of directions of behavior in Nepal because it's kind of quite a different river system. The Chambal's mostly one big river channel, whereas the rivers in Nepal are mostly kind of very braided lowland rivers. But we found kind of the same thing, that they're coming upstream, going quite far upstream, possibly because we're at the absolute sort of northern and altitude limit of where you get gharial. So in the monsoon, when it's hot, they're going further upstream, catching fish, going to these like highly braided parts of the river to catch fish. And then some of them are then going all the way downstream in the through the winter in time for breeding in the spring. The females are also a bit limited in Nepal because there are currently only 3 adult males in all of Chitwan. So if they want to find a fella, they've got to go quite a long distance.
Yeah, must be nice to be a male gharial in Nepal.
Oh yeah, they're having a great time.
So it kind of sounds like they're almost like the crocodilian equivalent of salmon when it comes to their mating migrations, almost.
Yeah, absolutely. They will, yeah, make these really impressive journeys, and kind of how and why they're navigating to those particular sites. I guess a really interesting question. So some, I think the really amazing navigation abilities have been seen as saltwater crocodiles, which will travel like 900 kilometers. So presumably, how they're navigating and how gharial are navigating might be quite similar. Um, I can't tell you how they do it.
Yeah. Uh, well, unlike salmon, at least they don't have to jump up waterfalls into a grizzly's mouth. So,
Oh yeah, so it's well avoided.
yeah.
I think, yeah, by the time you get to being an adult gharial, there's very, very little that's going to try and eat them. Although we have had a report in the 90s that a tiger killed an adult female gharial who was gravid at the time. Um, which, so there is someone always bigger than you until you're a big male gharial, and then no one's bigger than you.
Yeah. So you mentioned that male skips like 6 meters or about 20 foot long.
Yeah.
Yet they don't really pose that much of a threat to humans, correct?
Yeah, so there's actually no recorded incidences of a gharial killing a human. There are a couple of cases of one um, sort of biting or striking a person. But generally, it's been thought that that was either accidental, thinking maybe it was a fish, or sort of protecting its babies. But yeah, they really don't pose a threat to people um, in the way that other crocodilians do, which is very nice when you're trying to conserve them, because you don't have to contend with um, ensuring that people are safe from a species you're reintroducing, because everyone's pretty safe from a gharial.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's really impressive considering how long there's been large human populations coexisting along waterways gharials live in.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, because the Ganges, where they still found today, is one of the most densely populated parts of the whole world. Um, so it's remarkable that there are still gharial at all when there's like a really high human pressure. But we find in Nepal, people are really keen on having gharial in their rivers. We've we kind of have generally found that when we've gone back, and so as we go, we've shared all our data and everything we found with sort of local interest groups. So almost everyone on the team other than me is from the local area, and we kind of go back and share everything as we go with everyone about what the threats are, what's happening, where we're finding them. And it's been really lovely to see how different kind of community groups have responded. So, for example, when we were concerned that there was a high amount of sort of pollution and litter in some of the areas where the gharial were nesting, one of the sort of local community forest groups organised to meet with the mayor and discuss how landfill was getting disposed of and why it was ending up in the river. And so people are really interested to make changes to keep the rivers they live alongside beautiful, but also suitable for species like the gharial to live in. So it's always, it's a really inspiring part of the world um, to live and work in. When I'm originally from the UK, and I feel like people don't have that same sort of interest and tolerance of wildlife that we see in Nepal. So yeah, I learn a lot from people.
And I just gotta bring this up. You are a National Geographic explorer, which is a pretty cool title to have.
Yeah, it is a very cool title. It makes me feel very exciting. Yeah, so National Geographic have very kindly one of our big project sponsors. So they funded the purchase of most of the telemetry devices, um, and I work very closely with some National Geographic Edge Fellows. So the gharial is an edge species, which means it's evolutionarily distinct and globally endangered. So because the gharial is this really unique species with few close living relatives on the tree of life, but also very close to extinction. It kind of gets ranked as one of these priority species for conservation. In particular, I've worked very closely with Ranjana Bhatta, who's a Nepalese Edge Fellow, who's been looking at reproductive ecology and acoustic communication of gharial in Chitwan, which has been a really fascinating project as well. So she's been kind of looking very closely at these amazing reproductive behaviours and how where those are occurring in the park, and how we can focus kind of conservation on these key behaviours that are vital for the population to continue reproducing. Because they do this really weird like courtship dance. So the males go up to the females, and she's got to choose to mate with him. So the male goes through a lot of efforts to try and get the female, to win the female over. And so they make this noise, this loud pop. They blow bubbles, they hiss, and they do this kind of body roll in the water to kind of shows off their back and then their tail, and they go underneath blowing bubbles, which is incredibly cute. Especially when you feel really sorry for them then, because the male will do this all day and maybe one female will let him mate with her and the others are all just like, not today, mate.
Uh, yeah. So, hmm. So, what is the future outlook for gharials in Nepal looking like right now?
I'm it it's kind of one of those things which is so it's so difficult to determine. On the one hand, I'm really optimistic because the population is increasing. There's awesome initiatives being set up by community groups for conserving rivers and river species. There's currently a crocodile conservation festival being organised by a friend of mine who's a very young conservationist to Siddhartha, in order to sort of get this interest and recognition in gharial and muggers among local communities. And lots of other people trying to interested in doing projects. And being involved in conservation. And Nepal has an awesome record of incredibly successful conservation, doubling tiger numbers, increasing forest cover. So on the one hand, like if they're going to be doing well anywhere, I'm optimistic about Gharial in Nepal. But then the threats on rivers throughout South Asia are just absolutely huge. There's so much building of, hydroelectric power, which is kind of disrupting the river, preventing fish migrations, and also just like really intense levels of pollution, further downstream in the Ganges system. Some areas are sort of ecologically dead because they are so polluted. And if, countries have to be really careful to look further downstream and say, right, we actively have to avoid this happening here, because if you just kind of let cities develop without really focusing on clean water and sanitation, then that ends up polluting the rivers, which most importantly has a really negative impact on people who rely on those rivers. People need clean water to survive.
Yeah.
People directly take water from these rivers for washing and drinking. So in the first instance, keeping rivers flowing, keeping rivers clean is vital for people. And then, of course, next is also vital for wildlife, including gharial. So yeah, it's all. And then there's the sort of who knows what's going to happen with climate change, because all of these rivers where gharial exist, the main parts of the river originally are sourced in the Himalayas, and those glaciers they come from are shrinking every year. And although that's not going to be the majority of water in the river, the majority is going to come from rainwater. It's still this kind of an unknown thing that humans are impacting, and that you have completely no control over. Nepal is very concerned about climate change being on the roof of the world. Everest in Nepal, it's so high, and the impacts of climate change are being felt already. But it's a little country that has kind of no control over the much bigger countries that are driving the trends.
So current range of gharials is nowhere near as wide as they once were back in the day, right?
Yeah, sadly not. So they've completely disappeared from at least 94% of their previous range. So and that's an optimistic
Right.
percentage. So they used to occur from the Indus and Pakistan in the west, all the way through northern India, Nepal, Bhutan, out to Bangladesh and eastern India, possibly as far as Myanmar, throughout the Brahmaputra, Ganges, and Indus basins. And they're now left in just 14 super isolated localities in India and Nepal, all on the Ganges. And it's likely that quite a high number of those kind of localities are just individuals that have washed downstream from higher populations. There's only about 6 populations that show recent reproduction and recruitment. So yeah, they're doing really badly. And of those sort of 6 reproducing populations, only 1 is viable and self-sustaining, and that's in the Chambal River Sanctuary in India, where there is most of the world population in a single river. So that cannot overstate how important that one river is for gharial conservation in general. So yeah, it's so sad to think if you can look back at reports from 100 years ago, and people comment on how the long-snouted alligator is so numerous in the river that you can shoot 10 every 10 minutes. This kind of description of how many were in the river, and now there's probably less than 1,000 adults in the whole world. But I mean, I'm optimistic in places where the river system is quite well protected. In parts of Pakistan, they may have gone extinct, but there are parts of the river where you still find river dolphins. So it's not impossible they could be reintroduced successfully in the future. And indeed, there has been a successful reintroduction of gharial in somewhere called Hastinapur in India, where they went totally extinct. And then a WWF-led project has reintroduced them successfully. And they're still not big enough to breed yet, but it would be really awesome if they did. So yeah, it's hopefully things will get better. And as long as freshwater conservation is prioritized, they stand as good a chance as any freshwater species.
Yeah. So do you know of any like proposed projects to maybe reintroduce gharials to, say, the Indus River or anywhere else along the former
Um,
range?
So there have definitely been discussions about introducing them to various other parts of India. I believe that Bhutan and Bangladesh have also talked about reintroducing them. Um, and I was actually on a phone call just earlier this morning with a early career conservationist in Pakistan who is discussing doing some sort of preliminary field studies for identifying potential sites for reintroduction. Um, so yeah, that's why I'm feeling very optimistic today.
Oh, glad I caught you in a good mood.
To be honest, I'm always in a good mood when I get to talk about Gharial.
Yeah, it puts me in a good mood too. Ah, well, any other thing you want to talk about?
Oh, trying to think exciting things about Gharial. Um, 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 I mean, endlessly. There's always endlessly exciting things to talk about Gharial. But I think we've probably covered um, most of the most of the things about the project I can think of. I'll probably think of something in like 20
Yeah.
minutes and be like, oh, I definitely should have mentioned that.
Yeah. Do you have any connection with the or did any work with the Madras Crocodile Bank with their gharials before?
Yeah, so I haven't personally worked with the Madras Croc Bank itself, but it is a Madras Croc Bank project, the Gharial Ecology Project on the Chumbel, who I've worked really closely with and who have helped and advised us kind of throughout the whole process. Yeah, I mean they're a totally awesome organisation who've done so much for sort of conservation research and being linked up to this Gharial Ecology Project, which is immensely cool, um, and just kind of researching this vitally important Chumbel population. So it's basically one of the only sort of open, free-flowing rivers where, in fact, I think it's the only open, free-flowing river where gharials still occur. All the others have dams and barrages on it. Whereas this is such an important population to study because it's as close as you can kind of get to a natural system. Whereas everywhere else where we're looking at there still being gharial, it's not a totally natural system. You've got artificial reservoirs, you've got barrages fragmenting the habitat, um, whereas the Chumbel is is completely open and is in and of itself the sanctuary. So the sanctuary is for gharial and it's for the river. So it's designed with gharial in mind, and the sanctuary encompasses the whole river and both its banks. Whereas a kind of a problem, I think, a lot of freshwater conservationists will talk about is if you have got a protected area, a river is often the boundary. So one bank is protected and one bank isn't, and so that can lead to a kind of a bit of conflict with trying to work out um, to what extent is this river going to be protected? Is it going to be no take, no fishing? How is it those kind of other resources going to be extracted? And in Nepal, what we found in Chitwan is the primary sites where we have successful reproduction and where we have males year round are those small parts of the river where the national park is on both sides. Um, and that's not to say that the gharial aren't totally able to go through areas with high densities of people. They'll travel through those areas very happily, but it seems that those totally protected sections of the river are particularly important, which kind of I guess makes sense. If you're going to be sensitive to disturbance, then it's probably quite good to have a totally protected section of the river. It just makes them really hard to get to. We have to spend so much time going on little tiny canoes or walking and going downstream in a little tiny canoe and then walking like 5 hours back to try and get somewhere we can stay overnight. They're not a practical species to study. And they just love to those areas because they're these kind of really remote areas that they really like to be in. It's also sort of the areas where you get dangerous wildlife like wild elephants, which you really don't want to have to spend time with wild elephants. So
I'll take your word for it.
don't we spend a lot of time running away when we see a wild elephant. So it's just like a nightmare. I mean, it's wonderful. It's absolutely this complete privilege to get to work alongside such incredible wildlife, but it just does make everything really logistically challenging. So, and the babies hatch in like 40-degree heat at the like height of the pre-monsoon, so it's really really hot, and you've got to walk like 4 or 5 miles to try and just check if the babies are hatching. Um, and they all hatched late this year, so we had 3 weeks of going every morning and not even getting to see baby crocodiles. I was not impressed.
Yeah, kind of a weird experience to go looking for the 20-foot crocodilian that won't harm you, but the big herbivores will definitely hurt you.
Yeah, I know. It always really surprises people when they say, because there's a lot of tigers in the area, and obviously tigers are very dangerous, and human tiger conflict is a big problem for people living alongside the national park. But it's the elephants we're really scared of because you can't even yeah, you just have to avoid them. You can't just kind of moderate your behavior and be like, right, how does a tiger hunt? Right, how can we avoid this? Or similarly for other crocs, you can be like, right, which we just don't go to this bit of the bank of the river. Whereas with elephants, it's just like they look so cute on paper.
On paper.
On paper, yeah, yeah. I love them lovely from a distance when I'm in a car.
Good set of binoculars probably
Yeah,
helps.
absolutely.
So you mentioned places and rivers that don't really see any like fish being drawn or anything like that, being where gharials seem to prefer hanging out. Uh, do gharials and like native like fishermen and stuff like that have any sort of competition at all?
Um,
Or
Not really. So a lot of the team we work with who are actively involved in gharial conservation are from the sort of local and indigenous fishing communities. So lots of the people who do the gharial guarding, who notify the national park when they see gharial nests, and um, are directly involved in protecting those nests and those gharial, are from the local fishing communities because they have a wonderful knowledge of the river because they've grown up on it fishing there. So um, actually, a lot of those people are directly involved in conservation. There can be some conflict with some of these communities wanting to use certain types of fishing gear that are illegal. But we think that the primary issue is not the fishing communities who are very experienced and capable at using these types of nets and even in releasing gharial from them if they accidentally catch them. It's kind of people more casually doing a bit of fishing on the side at night, young men going out fishing, leaving a net in overnight. That's kind of more likely to lead to these conflict events where gharial gets caught and maybe killed. Um, so yeah, it's a tricky thing because yeah, people should, particularly from fishing communities, absolutely should have the right to fish in the rivers. Um, and it's just a matter of kind of balancing that so people can continue to have the rights and abilities to fish and safely fish, and also have opportunities to take up other careers and livelihoods if they don't want to fish, which is often something that leads to people continuing in these professions, as if they don't have any other opportunity. Um, but then at the same time kind of balancing that with ensuring that there's not this additional threat to gharial from people outside of fishing communities coming in and extracting fish, because that's when the sort of problems really start. So yeah, it's a really tricky thing to try and work out and how to deal with. The kind of broader ZSL project I'm a part of has been implementing community fish ponds in some of these communities to give an alternative both source of fish and protein, and a more steady and safe form of income for communities that can sort of do fish farming now instead of taking the fish directly from the river. So those kind of alternative livelihoods are one approach. But there's kind of thinking in terms of worrying about people fishing more broadly rather than just accidentally catching the gharial in the nets. And we don't think that there's a major problem with kind of overfishing in the rivers. However, some of the fishermen we work with have reported that they believe that the fish numbers have been decreasing. So, and when you see the fishing pressure in these rivers, like it's not super high compared to so many other parts of the world. So they're there's definitely a lot of research that needs to be done there to try and understand why these fish populations are going down. Because if people are relying on them, gharial are relying on them, we can't have them decreasing. And there's sort of a lot of concern about whether this is downstream pollution, or kind of other forms of sorry, upstream pollution ending up in the rivers, and why exactly it is that we might be seeing these kind of declining fish populations, or is it because the small tributary rivers that they rely on are perhaps being degraded in a way the big rivers aren't. So yeah, more research on fish in these areas also really important, because we kind of got a lot of not quite answered questions.
Yeah, reason I asked is I heard a while back that gharials and local fishermen actually target completely different species of fish, so there's like no, I guess, ecological competition. At least that's what I heard.
I don't know about anywhere else, but in Nepal, I think everyone catches the same fish. So gharial is super generalist, and
Okay.
people will eat any fish that are tasty. Um, Particularly, I think, yeah, both quite like the bigger fish. But I think it's been seen in India that gharial will eat a lot of invasive tilapia, which is
Hmm.
really interesting. So potentially also playing an important ecological role in removing that invasive species, and that's kind of been seen in a lot of different species. So there was a part of the Mobile Foundation, Philippines crocodile research. They found that the Philippines crocodile were eating the invasive, I think it's called the golden apple snail, which is it's a really bad crop pest in the Philippines. And they found that these crocs were eating a lot of these snails. And so, yeah, again, with the gharial eating tilapia, they're kind of these unexpected sort of ecological benefits of having crocs in systems, which is, yeah, something that is really interesting, trying to understand the role of crocodiles in their ecosystems, because they're so tricky to study, spending most of the time underwater, or doing things at night. And it's like the question is, are they performing the same role in river systems that like tigers or wolves are performing in as apex predators outside of them? So yeah, hopefully lots of interesting research going to happen in the future.
Yeah. Kind of a neat parallel I noticed a little bit closer to home where I live. I live in Ohio, and up in Lake Erie, we have our only endemic species of reptiles only found in our state is the Lake Erie water snake, and we've actually found that these snakes will sometimes up to 90% of their diet will consist of an invasive species of goby fish.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and the thing about those goby fish is they predominantly feed on the spawn and fry of native fish species. So people have actually seen with the increase of the Lake Erie water snake population, they've actually seen a bounce back in the native fishery stocks.
Oh wow, that's incredible. Oh yes, reptile conservation for the win. Having all the positive knock-on effects.
Yep. All right. Anything else you want to talk about, or?
I think, yeah, that's probably it's all my top croc facts. Um, um, no, thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's been really great to
Oh,
get to share a bit about our project.
oh, thank you. It's been a blast.
Yeah,
All right.
for sure.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Take care.